Okay, I would like to start this session. Hello, everyone. My name is Dolf Gillen. I'm the hydrogen lead and industrial decarbonization co-lead in World Bank ESMAP. And we're going to have a webinar today. The title is Navigating CBAM, Trade Competitiveness and Opportunities for Hydrogen-Based Industries. So the topic is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the European Union, which is a very interesting mechanism, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into how that is designed and what the implications could be. I've been in industrial decarbonization for more than 30 years, and the issue of competitiveness and potential carbon leakage has always been a major obstacle in moving. So this is a potential game changer to solve that issue. And we are seeing now the first year where that tool comes into operation. We have three excellent speakers to introduce the topic. We will hear from Marila Malisevska. We will hear from Morton Antal, and we'll hear from Antonio Fernandez Rodriguez. I will introduce them as they speak. Context is for us, this is a webinar in the series of the Hydrogen for Development Partnership. We have every month a webinar. So we are especially interested on the implications for hydrogen-based commodities. So we're talking especially ammonia and steel, and maybe we can also touch upon the question why methanol and jet fuel are not included in all of this. So our first speaker is Marila Malisevska. Marila is a senior economist in the Trade and Policy Facilitation team at the World Bank. So she deals with various trade-related aspects, policy designs, and implications of trade. And her background is very much also in computable general equilibrium models and applying them to trade. So without further ado, Marila, the floor is yours, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you for the introduction. Let me share my screen quickly. So. Okay, perfect. I'm going to do a brief introduction to our work that has been focusing on the implications of the EU CBAM for trade. And our analysis goes beyond hydrogen, ammonia, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology and the way we've been approaching the topic, and show some preliminary results. Just to give you kind of like take a step back and have a bit of a broader view on the topic. I'm not going to talk about what the EU CBAM is, because the speakers that will follow have very detailed discussion of the issues, and I'm sure you'll appreciate their knowledge. So just as a recap, the reason why we wanted to look into CBAM is because it's obviously a very much trade issue. It's going to impact exports of developing countries of the cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizer, hydrogen and electricity, to various degree, because some of them are not as much traded as others, of course. And we wanted to capture in our aspects of the analysis, we wanted to capture the fact that the EU is also removing at the same time the free allowances. So as the CBAM will be phased in, the EU producers will be also, of course, facing higher prices, higher carbon prices, and as a result, the goal of the CBAM is to level the playing field, but an analysis that looks at the impact on exports of developing countries needs to take into consideration the fact that domestic producers in the EU will be also impacted quite heavily. So the way we approached it, we constructed a very simple CBAM exposure index, and we've done the methodological note, the dashboard, the blog, which I'm including the links to in case it's of interest. The index is very simple. It looks at the more exposed you are, of course, the more exports, the bigger share of your export is being directed to the EU. The total share of your exports of a particular product. And of course, the more impacted you are, the higher is the emission intensity of your product relative to the EU counterparts and also, of course, relative to other exporters. This is basically what's going to be driving your relative competitiveness. So maybe to go back, there are several caveats linked to this simple measure, of course. The initial work that was done used sector-wide averages and not individual firms' emissions simply for the lack of data. It's based on the Global Trade Analysis Project database, but we've also revised this data following the publication of the default values in December 2025 at the product level, and I'll touch upon this issue in the next few slides. But just to explain the methodology, if you look at the left-hand side chart, what you see is are the two elements of the CBAM exposure index. On the vertical axis, you see the carbon cost intensity, which could be seen basically like a tariff equivalent. We know CBAM is not a tariff, but you can think of it in this way. So what's the carbon payment per unit of exports or production in case of the domestic producers in the EU? And along the horizontal axis is the EU trade dependence, defined as the share of exports of a particular good, in this case fertilizer, going to the EU, as the share of exports of fertilizer to the world for those particular countries. And here we're showing countries, kind of the top countries with the biggest and the lowest exposure. And let's take an example of Egypt. I hope you can see it. It's on more or less in the middle of the chart. And the way to interpret it is that if you look at the share of exports, it's about 46% of Egypt's exports of fertilizers are directed to the EU. And if you look at the carbon payment, it's about maybe 90%, which is quite high as the tariff equivalent, right? But one has to remember that the EU will be also facing much higher prices, which in this case is represented by the orange line for the EU average in terms of the equivalent carbon payment. And if you look at the gray line, it's the equivalent carbon payment for the most carbon-intensive EU countries. So compared to the EU average, yes, Egypt is still facing relatively higher costs, it's less competitive. But if you think of the three worst kind of the least cleanest producers in the EU, Egypt could be still more competitive a bit. There are a few, very few countries that are actually more carbon competitive, let's call it, or less emission intensive than the EU, and those are below the orange line. And the same information is represented on the right-hand side, just a combination of the two. And you see that, for example, those countries in green may potentially gain competitiveness as they are relatively less carbon intensive, and this applies to Jordan, Belarus, Serbia, according to our data, and a few countries on average are more carbon intensive: Egypt, Uzbekistan, Ukraine. And again, big caveat, which I'll come back to, this is data at the average sector level, not the firm level, which will be used to assess CBAM payments, and which can be very different than the sectoral average, of course. And then another example for iron and steel, using again sector average data, we see that in principle payments are much lower, and we see as a share of exports, and we see that Egypt, India, Uzbekistan, again Ukraine seem to be pretty exposed, but a bunch of countries seems to be relatively more competitive or carbon competitive: Lebanon, Dominican Republic, Morocco. So this is just a tool to try to see the initial exposure. And of course, one needs to have a proper economy-wide assessment, taking into consideration the increases in fossil fuel prices and so on, which we also do using computable generic models. But as a first pass, you see that it could be a big chunk of money, quite significant payment for a few sector countries. But if you take a step back and look at this exposure as a share of GDP, it seems to be relatively small. So the total excess carbon payments as a share of GDP, hardly ever exceed 0.1% of GDP. Only on a few countries such as Mozambique, Ukraine, Egypt, they seem to be relatively higher. So even at the macro level, it doesn't seem to be a big issue. Of course, there will be companies, exporters that are likely to be impacted significantly. Now, I don't want to give you too much detail on this, just wanted to raise the issue that, of course, the results depend critically on what type of the emission intensity is using and what type of indicators, whether it's based on mass or the value of the product. And depending on which measure you use, you can reach very different conclusions. For example, in the second quadrant, the value-based measure gives higher exposure than the mass-based, and in the fourth quadrant, it's the opposite. So doing those high-level assessments, basically, depending on the data, can give you very, very different results, which of course underscores the importance of using firm-level data as much as possible. Now, very briefly, in December 2025, as you know, the Commission has released the default values as part of the implementing regulation. So we have revised, kind of updated our analysis based on those default values, which are at the product level, not at the sector level. And I wanted to show you a couple of charts for ammonia and hydrogen, which I know are of interest for this seminar. And so, for example, if you look at the default emission intensities that were published by the Commission, countries that are kind of most exposed or those facing relatively high values, for ammonia, it's Algeria, Brazil, China, Egypt, and for hydrogen, China is facing a much higher default value, for example, 26 compared to the global average. Egypt, on the other hand, is below the global average. So this is really where you want to look more carefully at the trade exposure using those default values, because those that will be the values that the countries will be facing unless they can, of course, demonstrate their actual emission intensities. And from that perspective, a couple of countries come as relatively exposed. So in the case of ammonia, it's Brazil, Libya, and Algeria, which could become relatively less competitive because they are facing really high default values, and with lower exposure for countries down the line. On the other hand, if you're okay, yes, I'm just showing ammonia. So just to wrap it up, I mean, the default values are kind of like a first pass to try to see who may or may be losing relative competitiveness on the EU market and might be losing their exports to the EU. Of course, there are options to redirect to other countries or improve the production in terms of the lowering their carbon intensity. So first of all, we know that CBAM poses challenges. Of course, the exporting first may have different profiles than the averages we have been showing you or the default values. But in order to be able to benefit, and they need to demonstrate that they're actually more carbon efficient. So that's important to take into consideration. Firms will, of course, need to document those lower emissions, and it's unclear. The Commission has been improving, like making changes to legislation to make this compliance easier, but it's not clear to what extent those benefits will actually translate into simplifications for exporters from developing countries. Yes, it's making it easier for smaller EU importers, but as long as they are importing from smaller companies in developing countries, those still will be facing challenges, and they might need technical and financial assistance to be able to demonstrate compliance. And I know that GIZ is working on this type of assistance. I'm hoping to hear maybe some more on this. And then CBAM, of course, creates also opportunities for those companies that can demonstrate that they are cleaner producers. And it's important not only in the context of exports to countries that impose CBAM, but also as part of the global value chains, many multinational companies, the private sector sustainability goals also impose the need to demonstrate emission intensities. So one can use this opportunity, of course, to improve carbon competitiveness of the domestic economy as a whole by imposing carbon pricing, and that will help achieve the NDC goals and, of course, increase domestic environmental benefits. And this is where the bank is very, very heavily involved, especially our colleagues working on carbon pricing and fiscal issues. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Marila. The main takeaway from your presentation for me is that you clearly showed that CBAM can be positive or can be negative for countries that export to Europe. So that's an important takeaway, that it's not always it's often perceived as a trade barrier, but it doesn't have to be. Depends on how clean your production is. We'll go a little bit deeper on that. We'll now hear from Morten Antal, who has a background in European law and policy. He's working for Hydrogen Europe on industrial and sustainability topics, and who will go a bit deeper into the mechanism itself. Morten, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Dolf. Thanks for the interesting presentation previously. Indeed, my name is Morten Antal, Policy Officer for Hydrogen Europe. We represent the entire European hydrogen value chain, so from the production side all the way through the sort of midstream and infrastructure parties in the sector, all the way to the off-takers, be that industrial off-takers, steel, ammonia, and so forth, refineries, or mobility users of hydrogen. So we have a sort of wider view of the European hydrogen sector, and also, of course, beyond that, because we are working together with our third country partners, not least in this context of CBAM, which has been quite a hot topic in the last 5 years. As you can see, Hydrogen Europe, we have over 600 members by now, including companies, big enterprises to SMEs, non-profits, regions, and national associations. So why was the CBAM really relevant? I mean, the presentation before me highlighted some aspects, but especially for the hydrogen and sort of adjacent sectors, so steel, ammonia, especially, it's very visible that in the sort of mid to long term, trade flows are going to be quite important towards Europe, and something to really level the playing field was very important for the European industry and for also carbon or climate policy at large, because of course in Europe we have the ETS, we have a polluter pay emission trading system, but to be able to compete with third countries, especially with a rising carbon price in Europe, there was a need to level the playing field and to establish the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which happened in the beginning of this decade and now is in force. So on this slide, I wanted to highlight the sort of trade flows that are expected from 2030 onwards. You can see that there is quite a lot of hydrogen derivatives, especially, so chiefly ammonia, and also methanol, and potentially gaseous hydrogen to be imported towards Europe, especially to Northern Europe and Northern and Central Europe. So Germany is going to be quite a big off-takers, and that's why, as these imports ramp up, we're going to be seeing a raising heightened relevance of CBAM, as those import hydrogen or hydrogen importers will have to pay CBAM. Why? What is actually CBAM? Just to really create a foundation, a basis with everyone here. It's a scheme to price the carbon content of selected groups upon import. So it's really for importers, and the third countries, especially the producers, need to work together with the European importers to be able to comply with this scheme, which is from now on mandatory for any importer above a 50-ton imports in these selected goods, which is in the sectors of steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, so ammonia, quite importantly, electricity and hydrogen, but no other hydrogen derivative, which Dolph already mentioned. For example, in the case of methanol or other e-fuels, is quite a big emission and something that needs to be taken seriously, and potentially going forward in an extension of the scheme needs to be taken on board. What it actually means for you, for the third country producers, and also for the importers in Europe, the way that the system works is the importer pays to the EU budget the carbon price per ton of CO2 equivalent, sort of equal to the price that they would have to pay should they be in the EU. So to sort of level the playing field with the ETS system that we have in Europe. There's going to be phasing in slowly. So in the beginning, with especially with the phase out of the free allowances that we have here in Europe, that's to solve the issue of carbon leakage that we have. So there's going to be a little bit slower phase in of the CBAM, so not the entirety of the embedded carbon needs to be sort of paid as a CBAM cost immediately, but it's going to be then that is calculated according to a methodology that I think Antonio will be describing a little later. But the fact is that from now on, from 2026, there needs to be a CBAM cost to be paid on any import in these CBAM sectors, and then of course that will need to be paid in 2027 regarding 2026, because most of the calculation is being done right now. So this is the sort of base level of the workings of the CBAM. As I said, Antonio will be going a bit more in the depth of it. As I mentioned, CBAM is there to level the playing field, especially as other third country emission trading systems are set up. So the overall idea is that there should not be a double burden on third country producers, for example, that already have an ETS system, some kind of an emission trading system, or sort of robust carbon pricing in place in their third countries. So increasingly, as new ETS systems ramp up in third countries, the CBAM cost will decrease in those third countries. So if in country X there is a robust ETS system that is compliant with the EU's ETS system, then of course the CBAM cost for the products that are imported into the EU from those from that third country will be sort of minimalized because of the compatibility between the two ETS systems. So it's very important to constantly monitor the development of one's own country's emission trading system, and especially monitor the secondary legislation that the European Commission is going to come up with to describe these third country emissions trading systems that are compliant with the EU's trading system, and hence would lower the CBAM cost for those products. So for hydrogen, which I mean is the main topic for today, what does it mean? What does CBAM mean? What needs to be calculated? What needs to be sort of looked at? So of course the quantity of the hydrogen that is to be imported. So for the third country exporter, they would need to provide information and provide documentation regarding the quality of hydrogen, of course the production method of that hydrogen as well, and therefore the direct CO2 emission embedded in the goods, which needs to be paid for as embedded emission. But also documentation about the indirect emissions embedded in those goods, which as of now does not need to be paid for because of some consistency with the EU regulation. The main point is that direct emission needs to be paid for. Indirect emission embedded does not need to be paid for now, in the case of hydrogen. And of course, documentation information about any carbon price due in the third country. That's relevant for the point that I made earlier. And also on the other contextual information regarding the production of the hydrogen, such as the production routes and sector-specific parameters. This is very similar to how it is with the European producers that are compliant with the EU ETS. A lot of information about the production method needs to be provided to the EU bodies and the customs authorities. I also wanted to touch upon the sort of hydrogen adjacent sectors like clean steel and clean ammonia in a little bit. For these goods, also the quality of iron and steel goods needs to be reflected in the documentation that is going to the importer. For steel, the direct CO2 emission embedded in the goods needs to be paid for, and also the indirect emission embedded in the goods. So if it's a sort of low carbon steel or clean steel that is produced through a completely electrified process, for example, then also the indirect emission embedded in the good needs to be paid for as a CBAM cost. Again, any carbon price due in the country of origin. For now, this is only relevant for a few third countries, but as these systems ramp up, this is going to be an increased relevance. And again, some contextual information about the CBAM goods. Sorry. So with regards to steel, for example, it's important to note that it's not the sector as such that's covered. It's select goods, mainly because the compliance needs to be done through customs channels, for example. So therefore, the combined nomenclature, so the CN codes, are the relevant sort of indicators for what the actual good is when it enters into the European Union. So there is a long list of CN codes, especially in the case of iron and steel goods, that are under the scope of the CBAM. So you would need to look into the select goods, and if you're an importer, if you're a producer, then you would be contacted by the importer, and you need to provide information about all these elements once you're exporting to the European Union. And then regarding the ammonia sector, very similar to the steel. Again, the quality of the product, the embedded direct emissions. And with regards to the indirect emissions, some documentation needs to be done. Again, the carbon price in the third country and other information. And again, here, this is the sector of fertilizer, but ammonia itself is one of the CN codes that is covered. So even if you're providing or exporting fertilizer or ammonia, clean ammonia for mobility reasons, for example, or as an energy carrier, then you are still under the scope of CBAM because it's technically a fertilizer product. So these you might already know, but what it's very important to note that in December of 2025, a large package of legislative documentation came out, the European Commission, regarding some elements on the possible extension of downstream goods of the CBAM. This refers mostly to steel and aluminium products. So they introduced an extra 180 steel and aluminium products that are to be under the CBAM from 2028. With this, the European Commission introduced the idea that CBAM is going to go beyond primary materials and will cover other materials. So beyond materials, also products. So there is a possibility that this scope is going to be further extended through the legislative process in Europe. But there is now an agenda that and further extension of the CBAM is envisioned. This still mostly refers to the industrial value chain. So a vast majority of these downstream goods are still under sort of industrial applications and less so household products, although a few are included there as well. Another element that was proposed in this sort of CBAM update that came about in December of 2025, anti-avoidance measures. So quite a few measures needed to be implemented to close some certain loopholes that importers and third country companies were introducing to this mix, sort of reporting abuses and lack of traceability. So the Commission took steps to limit the possibility of misdeclaration of both the goods and especially the emissions, the embedded emissions of those products and goods. And as a last step, maybe it's a bit less relevant in this context here in this room, the temporary decarbonization fund was introduced by the European Commission that sort of connects to the CBAM, whereby European producers to limit the very last bits of potential carbon leakage. These European producers that are very export heavy in their production would get an additional support to really level the playing field between the third country producers and the European producers. I wanted to also introduce this notion of Article 27A. You might have heard about it as a temporary suspension clause that was introduced by the European Commission, and there was, especially in the very beginning of this year, quite a lot of political push and political discussion about potentially really taking out goods from the scope of the CBAM. You might have heard that fertilizers are not in the CBAM anymore. This is untrue, of course. This proposal of 27A was only introduced by the European Commission. It's not law yet, and as far as we saw and heard from discussions between the co-legislators and also by the European Commission, this 27A and this clause about potentially moving goods from CBAM sort of unilaterally by the European Commission, that's not going to be in place or not going to be placed as a law. So just wanted to reflect on this because you might have seen some news stories, some discussions about this. And as a last slide regarding next steps for the CBAM, just to give you a timeline on what is actually still to come. As you know, the CBAM entered its definitive phase. So for now, everything is in force, and the actual CBAM payment will have to be made in 2027 because that's the sort of delay that you have when you're collecting the information and the production data. But everything is in force. Everything is going ahead now with the cover goods. Next month, on the 7th of April, the European Commission already announced that the first CBAM price is going to come. This is going to be a good sort of opportunity for the importers and also for the third country producers to see what is the actual CBAM cost that they need to be calculating with when they're importing, and of course when they are setting their prices. And regarding early 2026, this third country CBAM price methodology is going to be coming from the European Commission. This reflects on the map that I showed you a little earlier regarding the third country emission trading systems that are already in place, and carbon pricing schemes that are in place that could remove part of the compliance cost with CBAM. So the overall methodology and potentially additional annexes will come. The European Commission said early 2026. This might come in the next month or so. And then in 2027, we know that there is a new sort of refinement of the CBAM that's to come. Because it's such a new tool, a new policy instrument, there is a constant sort of refining and tweaking going on. You might have seen in the past year and a half with sort of simplification activities by the European Commission. Some elements are tweaked. For example, the threshold was the compliance threshold was raised, so now it's everyone that imports over 50 tons of CBAM goods. So that removed the vast majority of sort of SMEs and smaller companies that would have been compliant, but now they aren't. So there might be some additional refinements and simplification done. And by the end of 2027, the European Commission will come out with its biennial report on the CBAM. So that's every 2 years, the European Commission is going to review the scheme itself. So these are the major steps that there are to come. Potentially there might be something else, but for now, let's keep it at this. And I would like to give the floor back to Dolf, and I'm very happy to answer any questions should there be any until the end of the webinar. So thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin, for that interesting and insightful presentation. There are some questions in the Q&A, so you may want to have a look, and then we come back to it after the last presentation. So now, third presentation, we'll hear from Antonio Fernandez Rodriguez, who is in the EU Policy and Regulations Advisory of GIZ. So he focuses on the CBAM and how renewable hydrogen can help to reduce CBAM exposure. And with that, Antonio, the floor is yours.
Yeah. So thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And as Dolf mentioned, I work for GIZ for a project called the PTX Hub. And basically our goal is to support our partner countries to decarbonize their economy with the help and support of fuels and other goods that are produced from renewable electricity. So in this context, we have developed what we have named the CBAM PTX toolkit, and I think here one of the key words, and is also what you mentioned, Dolf, is that CBAM can also represent a great opportunity. A great opportunity for those that are able to decarbonize, and not just that are able to decarbonize, but that are able to show that they have decarbonized. And for this, it's very important to monitor and report emissions according to the CBAM rules. And in JSET, in the hydrogen cluster, together with the International Hydrogen Ramp-Up Program called H4D, we have developed this CBAM PTX toolkit in order to support those installations that have decarbonized or that are in the process of decarbonizing, to monitor and report their emissions under the CBAM method, and to be able to show, look, we have decarbonized, so therefore we will have an opportunity and advantage under CBAM. So the toolkit, that is what I'm going to present to you after, I think Martin provided a great overview of the state of play of CBAM, what CBAM is and how it works. So our toolkit has three main components. So the first component focuses on the production of hydrogen. The second component focuses on the production of fertilizers, and for both we have tried to explain how the CBAM methodology for emission accounting should be applied to both sectors. And in order to make the exercise a bit more real, we have counted with the support of Tufts Island that has played the role of a verifier. As you know, the emissions that are monitored and reported based on actual emissions, not based on the full values, they have to be verified by an accredited verifier. So that's why we have to involve someone that is going to probably get accredited as a CBAM verifier. So those are the first two legs, and then we have a third leg of the toolkit, which is a market offer overview for service providers that are working on solutions to help monitoring and, for instance, reporting emissions, like, for example, creating softwares or other tools that can facilitate this goal. So that's the overview of the toolkit in general that I'm going to introduce today. And then we are going to start delving into a bit more detail of what each of the document contains. So for hydrogen, in the end, the objective was to introduce and explain the main considerations for hydrogen under the CBAM, and also explain the application of the CBAM methodology for emission accounting and how it applies to the hydrogen sector. We have introduced three different production pathways. So the production of hydrogen through steam methane reforming with natural gas and CCS. The production of RFNBO, so renewable hydrogen, and also hydrogen that is produced with electricity from the grid. For fertilizers, we have done exactly the same, but we have just focused on a mixed fertilizer, which is an NPK 15. That is using ammonia and urea as a precursor. We will have a look at this in more detail later. And for fertilizers, we have introduced in the document as well a sort of calculation based on data that we sort of invented on how the cost calculation under CBAM will look like. And then for the monitoring and reporting tools, it's a very basic Excel sheet with service providers that are working on exactly this, on tools to facilitate the monitoring and reporting of emissions. So in concrete, what does the toolkit contain? So with regards to relevant considerations, what we have included is, for example, for hydrogen and fertilizers, okay, what are the G emissions that are under scope? No, for hydrogen is CO2. For fertilizers, there are some NOx that are included as well. What are the CN codes included? So which goods in these sectors are relevant for us? What are the main elements to determine the financial adjustment as well? We have tried to conceptually explain and break down the formula to calculate the financial adjustment that will be paid by the importer. And then we have tried to explain the difference between using actual emissions versus the full values, pros and cons, etc. that's more the general part of the document. And then we have as well gone a bit more into detail on how to monitor and report emissions. As we have described the methodology, the CBAM methodology. And then, we have explained how to set the system boundaries for both sectors. We have explained the formulas and what each formula contains and how to use them. And then as well, as I said, for fertilizers, we had run sort of mock cost calculation. And then, as I said, for hydrogen, the production pathways that we have included is renewable hydrogen, SMR with CCS and electrolytic hydrogen. And then for fertilizer is basically a mixed fertilizer. And then we have compared the use of a FMBO to produce the ammonia that this mixed fertilizer is using. And then as well, one that is produced with ammonia based on gray hydrogen. So, of course, my intention is not to give you any detailed summary of the documents. It's just to give you a flavor of what the documents contain. And for this, just thought about providing some highlights. So basically, after applying the CBAM methodologies to our examples, the conclusions that we have reached is that for FMBOs, probably we are talking about embedded emissions of zero, both direct and indirect. As Martin mentioned, for CBAM for now and for hydrogen, just direct emissions are in the scope to calculate the financial adjustment. So that's why they are circled in red. Then we see that for the hydrogen produced with SMR, with carbon capture and storage, the emissions are a bit higher, meaning that there is a higher exposure to the carbon price for this type of hydrogen, although emissions have been reduced in comparison with gray hydrogen. Here is important to acknowledge that there are some requirements for CCS under CBAM that has to be fulfilled. Not all sort of CCS is accounted for emission reduction under the CBAM methodology. So basically, the carbon has to be stored underground for a long period of time, or also captured in long-lasting products. And then we have taken as well the example of producing hydrogen through the electrolysis. And here we have taken an emission factor of the grid that is close to the UL average. And of course, there are no direct emissions, but we have some indirect emissions. But as I said, for hydrogen, indirect emissions are not included. And therefore, this is a sort of paradox where even if we consider both direct and indirect emissions, the electrolytic hydrogen has, of course, higher emissions. Then under CBAM, as indirect emissions are not in a scope for the financial adjustment, it would be equal to their FMBOs, basically. So that's for hydrogen, and of course there are much more details in the document. And then for fertilizers, we have done a little bit the same. So we have taken a mixed fertilizer, and then, as I said, we try to explain, okay, what are the steps to follow according to the CBAM method. So we have drawn the system boundaries of the installation, and then you see that to produce this fertilizer, you need two precursors. The precursors are the input materials that are in CBAM scope. So we have urea and ammonia. And then we have, to produce this fertilizer, the process used is the granulation with a pipe reactor. So we have to monitor the direct emissions that are occurring there. And this installation is using natural gas. So we have compared the production of this mixed fertilizer units using an RFMBO for the ammonia production, and also renewable electricity for all the indirect emissions, because for fertilizers, in this case, indirect emissions are in the scope of CBAM. And then we have compared with a mixed fertilizer using SMR hydrogen for the production of ammonia. And also the electricity emissions are not from renewable sources. So we will have as well here some indirect emissions. And the conclusion is that basically just greening the emissions coming from electricity and emissions from the hydrogen molecules to produce the ammonia, we save approximately 50% of the emissions. That, of course, will be translated into an equivalent amount a monetary amount under CBAM, which represent a great decarbonization potential. Then, if we focus a bit more on one of the main precursors to produce this fertilizer type, which is ammonia, we see that here the emission reduction is bigger. So if we clean the ammonia production, if we introduce renewable hydrogen under the CBAM method, we can save up to 70% of the emissions, which again will translate into an equivalent financial savings, and will probably provide a competitive advantage under CBAM vis-a-vis other ammonia-based products which are produced with fossil fuels. So those are one of the main conclusions of the paper, and the issue that we have is that, as you may know, and Martin already mentioned, is that in December there were a set of implementing and delegated acts that were adopted by the European Commission and that will govern the rules for the definitive period. And one of these implementing act is on an emissions methodology that will apply throughout the definitive period, meaning that the methodology that we had for the transitional period is no longer in place. So this means that we will have to adapt our toolkit and then probably dig a little bit deeper into this new methodology that has been adopted. And now we will have as well a much clearer picture on how to calculate as well the financial adjustment, and we can run the calculation based on a more factual data, because as it was mentioned, now we have the emission, so the default values published. We have also the benchmarks, the CBAM benchmarks that have been published. The first price for the CBAM certificate will be published in April, so we can now do a much more an exercise that is much more close to reality, let's say. So this is a simple summary of why the toolkit is still valid but has to be adapted. So what has not changed is, for example, the rationale and the main objectives of the CBAM. Of course, the emissions scope for fertilizers and hydrogen, the CN codes that are relevant for us in these two sectors, how to set the system boundaries, the fundamentals, the calculation formulas, for the attribution of emissions to goods. They remain basically the same, but there are many things that have to be reviewed. For example, we are not any longer talking for the definitive period about quarterly reporting. Now the reporting declarant will have to submit a yearly CBAM declaration, and the installations on third countries, they have to monitor and report their emissions on a defined format, so they have to produce a monitoring plan and an emission report. In our view, there is a decrease in the need of reporting softwares because this is going to be increasingly done through the European Commission platform. Now and after the omnibus, also third country installations and other entities can have access to the platform, so probably this will decrease the reliance on external softwares. Of course, the calculation of the price of the CBAM certificates, because we have now almost all the elements of the formula. We have as well the benchmark values that we can per CN code now that we can use. Also, the default values have been updated. They are not longer based on worldwide averages, but they are now based on country averages. closely monitor regarding fertilizers the proposed Article 27A. We are still awaiting the guidance documents from the European Commission and an updated Q&A. For the transitional phase, there were great documents that were that were guiding everyone through the legislative documents that sometimes are not very easy to read. So we are awaiting the ones for the definitive phase so that we can adapt our toolkit. But that's everything in a nutshell. And again, happy to take questions now as part of the Q&A. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Antonio. I think that provided further clarity, what you explained. So we still have a little bit of a fluid situation, I understand. It's not easy. Let's see how we're going to do the Q&A. There are some questions, some technical questions in the Q&A. So first of all, there's a question about, and I thought I gathered from all three presentations that this is not only about primary materials, but the goal is that this is also extended to more refined final products. Is that correct?
Yes, maybe I can take it quickly. Indeed, so it started off as in the beginning with the primary goods, so the sectors that we mentioned, so cement, iron, steel, hydrogen, fertilizers, and they were announced as sectors by the co-legislators, and then of course that had to be represented in the legislation as CN codes. So it was CN codes of the primary goods themselves and some intermediaries. And then, of course, there was an idea that a lot of sort of avoidance or circumvention of the scheme can be done by importing the semi-final or even final goods, like especially for the case of steel heavy products. So there is the new push to extend the scope to downstream products as well. Already technically there was some downstream product in the initial or the first legislation, but that really represented nuts and bolts. So quite literally a few nuts and a few bolts that were included in the scope. Since then, in this new wave of revision, there is as I mentioned, the 180 new products that are steel heavy, aluminum heavy, final and semi-final goods.
Okay. And a related question. So if you now, instead of blast furnace steel, carbon-intensive blast furnace steel, you start exporting scrap steel to Europe. Is that what you mean by the scrap loop?
Exactly, that was the idea that already in the transitional phase, which was between 2023 and 2025, the Commission saw that was quite a substantial amount of because of course they can compare the actual sort of customs data that they have and the CBAM data. So they saw a discrepancy between the primary steel that Europe was importing, and of course the scrap steel that were imported. And of course, quite a lot of that is scrap steel, which still has some embedded emission. So they realized that okay, this could even rise because of course some of that scrap steel is going to be a lower emission, so there's going to be a switch there, and the import of that scrap steel is going to rise, so that needs to be included in the CBAM. So therefore they introduced pre-consumer scrap, at least in the CBAM, but that's still in the legislation phase. So of course it's not entirely sure that it's going to go ahead, but it can be assumed at least that it's going to be included in this scope.
Okay. Then there's a question about will emissions from transoceanic transport be accounted for?
Yeah.
And how does that link with the Fuel EU maritime regulation? Who wants to answer that?
Yeah, maybe I can take this one. And Martin, please feel free to complement. The CBAM has a very specific emissions scope, which is aligned with the EU ETS, basically. So the focus of the emission scope is direct emissions, with some of the indirect emissions included for some sectors. Here, the emissions from transport would fall into a category which is probably scope 3 upstream emissions, which are not covered by the CBAM. So in this case, these emissions would not be accounted and reported, and therefore would not have any impact on the financial adjustment. Therefore, I don't see any link with the Fuel EU maritime regulation. Because in the end as well, the Fuel EU maritime regulation, if I'm not mistaken, it establishes emission reduction. It's based on emission reductions. So I think we are talking about two different things. So yeah, that's
okay. Good. Marilla, a question for you maybe. So if you have these different emission trading schemes, so if a country that wants to export to Europe has already an emission trading scheme in place, but that emission trading scheme is less strict than the European ETS, then how are we going to correct for that? How is that going to work?
I think it's $1 million question. And at least to my understanding, the Commission is supposed to still provide guidance on this. But the countries are, of course, supposed to get credit for the carbon content that was priced at home. But to my understanding, there is no clear specific guidance on this yet. And I think it is supposed to be published in April. But okay. Martin is nodding, so the timeline is aligned. So bottom line is there will be some credit. We don't know how exactly it will be calculated as of yet.
Okay. Maybe I can also give it, I think it's entirely clear from Marilla. Just wanted to add that indeed they're working on it, and we heard that initially, of course, this should have been a bit more simplified, but then they realized that a lot of the third countries had quite nuanced carbon pricing regimes. Some third countries, maybe you are from these third countries as well. In this call, they have sort of differentiated tax regimes on carbon and also sort of tax alleviation, and they wanted to include those sort of nuanced tax regimes as carbon pricing as well, to comply with CBAM, which was not truly the scope of CBAM or the intention of CBAM. So that was I think DG Taxud needed to do quite a thorough methodology and revision of or review of the third countries' handling of carbon regimes per se, because I think initially in the legislation it was quite clear that okay, if there is a third country ETS, for example, like in the United Kingdom or in some states of the United States, which can be quite similar, then it's an easy fix. Then they just take the percentages, but now they need to do a lot of legwork regarding the different ways that carbon pricing per se can be considered.
Antonio, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add a couple of interesting points for our audience, maybe, which is that I think the Commission had already not defined exactly the rules, but have provided some guidance of the sort of carbon price that will be acknowledged for a reduction. And they always focus on having a system that is solid and consistent. And the key word that they use is that the carbon price has been effectively paid. It is still to be defined what is meant by effectively paid, but one of the key things is that it's not rebated, because there are many jurisdictions that may introduce a carbon price that is paid, but then there are subsidies that mitigate the effects of the carbon price. So you put a carbon price, but then you maybe upstream, but then downstream there is a rebate. So that's one of the key things that the Commission will be looking at. And then probably two new things regarding carbon pricing effectively paid, which is that in the European Commission proposal that was mentioned by Martin, proposed in December 2025, there is a mention to the possibility of awarding a role to Article 6 credits. It's still very, very vague. I don't have a lot of information on how this will be done, but I think it's important to mention it. And probably this will be part of this implementing or delegated act that will be published hopefully soon. And then as well, as part of the Omnibus simplification package, which was a package that was meant to try to simplify CBAM rules, there was the option was introduced to define default carbon prices per country. So I think that's something that as well the European Commission is working on, and that will alleviate a little bit of administrative or burden on the reporting declarants, because they will probably just need to go to a database or to an Excel sheet and take a value from there. So this decreases a little bit the need to provide a lot of requirements. So yeah, just wanted to mention these three things.
Very good. And then I see a last question in the Q&A, and that is about the emissions related to electricity. I understood from your presentations that for the time being, it's only about direct emissions. It's not about indirect emissions. But would these indirect emissions from electricity later be introduced, also accounted for, and would the same rules as for RFNBO apply with this spatial and temporal matching and for the additionality? Who wants to take that?
Maybe I can take it first, and then Antonio, if you have anything else. So regarding monitoring and reporting, both direct and indirect embedded emission needs to be reported and monitored. So in that way, both needs to be known, or the EU needs to be made aware regarding the select goods. However, regarding actual paying for CBAM on the indirect emissions, that's only for, I think, two sectors, or initially it was two sectors, cement and fertilizers. So in the case of ammonia, unless they changed it, but I don't think in the end they did. So for ammonia, indeed, indirect emissions needs to be both reported and paid on. So if it's RFNBO ammonia, even in that case, the indirect emission needs to be calculated and paid for if it's if it's relevant in that case. Unless of course with regards to RFNBO, if there's compliance with the criteria, then of course that would be zero. For example, for hydrogen, so if it's RFNBO hydrogen, then the indirect emission still needs to be looked into, but there's no payment that needs to be done on any potential embedded emissions regarding the indirect part.
Maybe if I can complement, as Martin said, indirect emissions are just in the scope for two sectors, which are cement and fertilizers. Maybe that's a simpler way to put it. And in order to give you an example of ammonia, imagine that you are producing ammonia for exports, and if in your ammonia production you are using hydrogen, and you are importing hydrogen from another installation, so what we call the precursor. in this case, you will have to account the direct and indirect emissions from your ammonia production, so both direct and indirect emissions. But for your hydrogen, you will have to just account the direct emissions. I am talking about the financial consequences, not just monitoring and reporting. That this is for. I mean, you have to include both. But the actual payment on emissions for your hydrogen as a precursor will be just direct emissions. For now, and if I'm not mistaken, this is being as well, I mean, a potential scope extension to include indirect emissions for other sectors is still on the table, but was not part of the European Commission proposal of December.
Indeed, maybe I can give a few other notes on this. Indeed, this has been a question for as long as CBAM has been a question, of course, the direct and indirect emission inclusion. The main argument behind not including the indirect emissions, or at least the financial obligations behind the indirect emissions for those sectors, is that in Europe, those sectors are eligible for a compensation mechanism that is linked to the electricity that is used in those sectors. So because of the way that the European electricity market is set up, there is an element of the ETS price in the electricity, and in order to alleviate that pressure, especially in those sectors that are decarbonizing through electrification, and so they to not be mandated or obligated to pay that extra ETS cost on that electricity, member states can provide financial assistance to those sectors. And it would be a double burden in those sectors if indirect emissions would be paid on those goods for imports and not in the regarding the production in the EU. So this is also to level the playing field this way for the third country products.
Thank you for these clarifications. Honestly, it sounds to me all very complicated.
I think the key message probably is that as long as you are decarbonized, it's not that complicated. Everything becomes much simpler. If you have 0 or close to 0 embedded emissions in your production, everything is simpler.
Okay. Mariela, any last thoughts from your side?
No, thank you. I mean, it's been very, very interesting, and yes, it seems like there's a lot of uncertainty about those carbon effectively paid issues and anxiety about the possible extension of the CBAM to other products. But I mean, it's more like a question to my colleagues who have been really following it very, very closely. Like, how likely do you think it is that those additional, products will be included under CBAM, and when? I know the proposal includes a lot of HS codes that are intensively still aluminum and so on. What's your assessment? Like, how likely is that to be included under CBAM in the coming year or two? Like, what's your take on this? I know it's speculative, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, maybe I can start. So with regards to the emissions extension scope, so the extension to indirect emissions, I think this is my personal opinion. I don't think this will happen in the short run, because I think the EU is focusing a lot on industrial competitiveness, and I don't think the EU member state would like to see this sort of support on the embedded cost of carbon for electricity removed. And I think that should happen if indirect emissions will be part of the CBAM scope. So indirect emissions for me, not in the short term. And for the extension of CBAM to other goods, when I was reading the recitals of the CBAM regulation, I mean, there is clearly one recital that says that the goal is to extend the CBAM to all ETS sectors. And if you read the emission report that accompanies the package that was presented in December, it's clear that CBAM is here to stay, and that the intention is to reinforce it and to extend it to other products. Which ones? I mean, what I hear from the Commission is that probably we'll start with organic chemicals, maybe some refinery products, I think glass. Probably they have higher chances to be included earlier on. But yeah, in summary, yes, I think CBAM will extend and cover more products, but always we have to keep the same product scope as the ETS. So sometimes people ask, will this be extended to agriculture? Well, probably not to agriculture or to textiles. I mean, as they are not ETS sector, probably not. So that's a little bit my opinion.
Very good. It's a 10:15. I'm sure we could talk all day about this, but I would like to conclude this webinar. Of course, if the participants have further questions, they can also ask you directly. And we will make the recordings and the presentations available if you agree. And then I'm sure we'll have more discussions on this as it develops in the coming 5 years. Yeah. So with that, I would like to conclude this webinar. Thanks very much to speakers. Thanks very much to the audience, and we look forward to welcoming you all in the forthcoming webinars in this series. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you.